All right. Welcome, everyone. Bonjour à tous. It's Tuesday, March 19th. We're here in Ottawa. I'm the moderator, Greg Quinn of Market News International. With us today to discuss the findings of the Auditor General's reports are the Honourable Patty Hajdu, Minister of Indigenous Services, the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs, and the Honourable Pablo Rodriguez, Minister of Transport. I believe there are probably some opening remarks, and then we will have some time for questions. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Hello, bonjour. It's a joy to be with you here on the traditional territory and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I want to start by thanking the Auditor General for this report, especially in the area that I'm responsible for, which is housing and First Nations. And her report clearly shows the dramatic situation that should come as no surprise to many people across this country, that the impacts of colonialism, discrimination, systemic racism continue to linger on in this country. And in fact, many chiefs and council members and indeed community members have talked about the ongoing and profound impact of a lack of affordable housing in First Nations. So the government appreciates the recommendations. We'll certainly work towards implementing them in the spirit of true partnership and self-determination that First Nations people want to do this work through. Obviously, having a safe home is important for everyone, and it seems almost self-evident that without a place to call home, a safe place to stay, that it's very difficult for people to raise healthy children, to be able to continue their education, to be able to have a safe place to rest after work, and to reach their full potential. We have a long ways to go to repair the deep, deep harms of ongoing colonialism. Oftentimes people talk about colonialism as if it's a historical situation, but in fact it's an ongoing reality that First Nations, Indigenous people live every single day in this country. My hope is that the Auditor General's report will bring the same fervor to the issue of First Nations housing as many Canadians feel about the access to clean water in First Nations, and it's certainly connected. Since our election, the Liberal government has increased investments by over 1,100% for housing on First Nations. So that results in 34,000 homes that have been built or are under construction, about 22,000 now completed and occupied, many more repaired. But there's still, as the Auditor General's report notes, a huge way to go. I will say, for the first time in recent history, the proportion of people living in overcrowded homes has stabilized, so we are not seeing numbers go up. But we need continued and we need ambitious investments to turn the tide and to start to see the kinds of changes that some First Nations are starting to report. Ça a des impacts concrets sur la vie de beaucoup de familles. En février, je suis allée au Yukon pour célébrer la construction de nouvelles maisons de la Première Nation de Liard. Le chef Charlie m'a raconté l'impact que ça a sur sa communauté. Parce qu'en ces mots, le logement est intrinsique à la santé et au bien-être. Il m'a expliqué comment l'appui de notre gouvernement les aide à lancer plein de projets qui vont bénéficier aux enfants et aux familles. Pour lui, la Première Nation de Liard est en train de tourner en coin. C'est radicalement différent de la situation où on était en 2015. Ça faisait des décennies que le gouvernement fédéral refusait d'investir ce qu'il faut pour construire des maisons de la Première Nation. So chiefs around the country in First Nations from coast to coast to coast are focused on ensuring that their communities have opportunities to grow, to sustain populations, to train their members, to provide the many essential services that communities require. And so the work that we're undertaking today is not just about numbers and increased investments, it's about supporting that self-determination and continuing our work to transfer to First Nations the care and control of housing, because in fact they know best how to meet their housing needs. Gone are the days where governments would determine what kinds of housing, where the housing should be, how the housing should be built. For example, the Assembly of First Nations, the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure, Indigenous Services Canada, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and Infrastructure Canada work together to develop the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. And this is the different approach that I believe is going to help us turn that tide that I spoke of. So as I said, there is progress, it is being made, but there is so much work to do. The housing challenge for First Nations is not a simple solution. It requires systemic change. There are many barriers in the way of communities that are looking to increase housing in remote areas, for example, transportation of infrastructure, access to skilled tradespeople. But I will say that the ability to find a home that's safe, that allows you to raise your children in peace and security is the primary thing that brought me to politics. And I do know that having a safe place to call home is the very foundation for everyone. It's fundamental for security, for mental well-being, and for economic independence. So this federal Liberal government will continue to be at the side of First Nations as we undertake this generational work of building homes that meet the needs of their growing communities. Miigwech, thank you. Merci.
Hey everyone, salut tout le monde. Alors, je suis vraiment content d'être ici avec mes collègues, Patty, Dominic. First, I want to thank the Auditor General and her office for the work on the performance audit on the National Trade Corridors Fund, which is an extremely important program for our economy, for our country. Depuis 2017, le Fonds national des corridors commerciaux a investi plus de 4,1 milliards de dollars dans 213 projets partout à travers le Canada. Et ça, c'est des projets qui visent à améliorer nos chaînes de rapprovisionnement nationales pour les rendre plus fluides, plus efficaces, plus robustes. Et les projets du fonds prennent toutes sortes de formes parce que le réseau du transport à travers le Canada, il est aussi vaste que varié. Donc, il faut pouvoir s'adapter à tout. Alors, ça veut dire, par exemple, des améliorations à Calgary, où on a investi 50 millions de dollars pour construire une nouvelle rampe d'accès, un nouveau tronçon de la voie Airport Trail. Je pense aussi au financement de 150 millions de dollars pour la construction d'un nouveau terminal à conteneurs pour le port de Montréal dans la section de Contrecœur. Il y a toute la liste inclut l'aéroport de Whitehorse, le port de Prince Rupert, et il y en a tant d'autres à travers les différentes régions, différentes provinces et territoires du pays. So I recently met with my provincial and territorial counterparts, and they were very clear about the fund. They're very, very clear. This program is essential for them, essential for Canadians. Why? Because NTCF supports key projects that are critical to our economy. So I hear the same feedbacks from different stakeholders, from the ports, from the railways, municipalities, and those that use our transportation network. So NTCF, absolutely critical as a program. So I'm proud that the audit found that Transport Canada did a good job in designing and implementing the NTCF. That said, we acknowledge the auditor's finding that Transport Canada do a better job in tracking the results. Alors, on est d'accord avec les deux principales recommandations du rapport. D'une part, les fonctionnaires de Transport Canada vont améliorer la documentation, donc pour favoriser la transparence. Et d'autre part, ils vont renforcer leur évaluation, leur suivi pour mieux rendre compte du travail accompli à la fois pour les projets en cours et les projets à venir. Alors, de façon concrète, on va améliorer nos systèmes de rapport et nos documents qui viennent en appui aux différentes décisions. Donc, dans les prochains mois, Transport Canada va continuer d'améliorer la collecte, le suivi, la communication de ces informations-là, tant pour les nouveaux projets que pour ceux qui sont déjà en cours. Alors, on est vraiment déterminés à soutenir un réseau de transport qui soit plus efficace, plus fiable, tout en veillant à s'assurer que le suivi de tous les projets du fonds puisse rendre compte. Alors, merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Merci, Pablo. Good afternoon. Bonjour tout le monde. Je tiens, comme mes collègues, à remercier la vérificatrice générale du Canada pour le travail qu'elle a accompli dans le cadre de l'audit de performance qu'elle a réalisé sur le programme des services de police des Premières Nations et des Inuits. I very much appreciated also the conversation I was able to have at the end of last week with the Auditor General who discussed the findings of her report. Le gouvernement du Canada accueille favorablement les recommandations du rapport d'audit et les efforts sont déjà déployés, évidemment, pour y donner suite. As part of our efforts to address the report's recommendations, Public Safety Canada has consolidated Indigenous-related programming and policy analysis into a single team to make program delivery more efficient and more transparent. This team is working with provinces and territories to identify improvements to the program and get funding to these communities faster. In addition, Public Safety has reviewed the program's relationship with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to better consider the availability of officers when making decisions around program management. And again, I had a conversation in this regard with Commissioner Duhem earlier this week as well. The RCMP is working closely with First Nations and Inuit communities to improve cultural awareness amongst its ranks. Notre gouvernement travaille également avec les communautés et les organisations autochtones à l'élaboration d'une loi qui reconnaîtrait les services de police des Premières Nations comme un service essentiel. Des séances d'engagement régionales dirigées par les participants autochtones ont eu lieu au cours des dernières semaines et une séance d'engagement nationale a eu lieu encore aujourd'hui. La collaboration continue avec nos partenaires des Premières Nations et des Inuits, les organismes chargés de l'application de la loi et les provinces est essentielle, évidemment, pour réussir dans nos efforts. In crafting upcoming legislation, we need to strike a balance between recognizing the unique realities of Indigenous communities when it comes to policing, while obviously respecting the constitutional division of powers, which gives provinces and territories oversight of the administration of justice in their jurisdictions. We are confident that we will find a way forward that will strengthen the delivery and the transparency of police services to Indigenous communities, and that's exactly the work that we intend to pursue. Merci beaucoup, et je crois qu'on va passer aux questions.
Merci. Now for some questions. I believe we'll start with Fraser Needham, APTN.
First question is for Minister Hajdu. It's the report gives your department pretty much a failing grade in terms of meeting objectives of closing the First Nations housing gap. I think it on both repairs and also new housing starts, the auditor says they've only met 20% of closing that gap. Is there any chance that the gap will be closed by 2030 as the government had previously committed?
Well, thanks, Fraser. And that's why that goal is in place, so that it focuses the mind of all departments of the Government of Canada that we need to work faster and that we need to be making ambitious investments like the ones we've already made, but I would argue more, and that we need to be working with partners to make sure that we have the creative solutions to closing that gap. I will also say, though, as I mentioned in my remarks, that part of the gap closure is for sure the fiscal investments that need to be made. There are other challenges that are in the way of people being able to quickly build and repair homes. And for example, very involved right now in northern communities' concerns about the viability of ice roads, not just this year, but into the future. And ice roads are critical for for remote communities. Glad I'm sitting next to the Minister of Transport as I speak about this, because indeed we will be needing to look at other ways to get materials, for example, to First Nations and remote communities in a cost-effective way. That has been a lifeline to northern communities to do the ordering and preparing for the building season, and that window is closing. And so there are other barriers in the way, but I think with a goal of closing the infrastructure gap, in particular on housing by 2030, it does sharpen the mind of all partners, and I think it's important to have those goals.
Follow-ups for the Minister of Public Safety. With safety on First Nations, such a big issue, as you know, just came off the Mal Sanderson inquest and whatnot. How do you feel about the fact that your department there's $13 million that it didn't get around to spending on safety, and it also, the RCMP is currently receiving funding for officers and programming that it hasn't hired?
So that's obviously was the source of my conversation with the Auditor General last week. I appreciated very much her advice and obviously her insight into this challenge. One of the difficulties in this space, but it doesn't in any way excuse our obligation to invest all of the funding allocated with the appropriate outcomes. In many cases, these are agreements with provincial and territorial governments as well, and Indigenous governments. Our objective, not different than my colleague said in the housing space, is to be in a position where we can support financially and in an ongoing long-term way, and that's the idea behind the legislation that we'll be introducing, Indigenous police services as essential services. So as we work towards that goal, my conversation with the Commissioner of the RCMP was earlier this week again, about the obligation of being able to say to these Indigenous communities for whom officers have been assigned or there's an agreement for supplementary police services, we need to be able to track and assure those communities that those services are in place. It's not a secret, Commissioner Duhem has talked about some of the challenges around recruitment in the RCMP and filling some of the vacant positions that exist. I think he's got an effective plan that will and has already started to deal with this challenge, but that's one of the realities that the RCMP is facing. But some of the plans that the RCMP have discussed with me give me a fair degree of assurance that that won't be one of the challenges that contributes to this circumstance, which is no longer acceptable.
Laura Thompson, the Canadian Press.
Hey there. We just heard from the auditor who was sitting where you're sitting now, and what she told us was that time after time, whether in housing, policing, safe drinking water, or other critical areas, our audits of federal programs to support Canada's Indigenous peoples reveal a distressing and persistent pattern of failure. And she's calling for a fundamental shift urgently in the delivery of services to Indigenous communities. Is the government looking at more radical changes in order to effectively deliver those services?
Well, thank you very much. And I think that's entirely the journey that we've been on since 2015, when the Prime Minister put reconciliation at the top of our agenda. We began to work with First Nations, with Indigenous partners across the country, of what a healthier relationship would look like. This is about a relationship, an ongoing relationship with Indigenous peoples. And let's not forget that these systems were designed and rooted in an attempt to extinguish indigeneity, an attempt to control Indigenous communities, and an attempt many times to keep Indigenous communities far away from urban centers. So it's about shifting an entire system. I think for me, when I look at the passage of the UN Declaration Act and the action plan that has accompanied that passage, when I look at the child welfare legislation that restores and has recently been upheld, thankfully, by the Supreme Court, that restores the inherent rights of Indigenous people to care for their children and families. When I look at the water legislation that I had the privilege of tabling just a couple months ago with First Nations partners beside me, that will serve as a framework to co-negotiate what actually is needed to appropriately fund the delivery of fresh water in this country, rather than a finance minister and a prime minister in the future determining themselves what is the appropriate amount. Those are the tools of change. But changing a colonial system overnight is not easy, because the system has never been designed to be collaborative. And so I'm really proud of the work that the Prime Minister and my colleagues are doing to try to really push the entire system to change and reflect how we better share decision-making, how we better share power, and how we better share resources in this country.
Thanks, Minister. And for Minister Rodriguez, the federal government launched a national infrastructure assessment in 2021 and produced a report with recommendations the same year that included establishing an independent commission to advise on infrastructure opportunities. But it's been, 2.5 years. The report has yet to be followed up on with further steps by the government. So when does it plan to act on that July 2021 report to create a national strategy on transportation infrastructure?
Well, we've been doing a lot of stuff on transportation strategy. We put in place also the supply chain office at the office of the transport minister, and based also on, as I said this morning, on what the Auditor General said. The main program at Transport Canada is working to support that transportation strategy. It's having an impact in every province, in every territory across the country, and we have to do a little bit better in terms of reporting on that, but as in terms of a program, it's working well.
I'll turn to the phone now. I see Peter Zimijic, CBC. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The Auditor General's report said that when it comes to housing, there were a few issues. First of all, it was the funding has stayed the same for decades, even though costs have been rising. That the government had been warned 4 times in 20 years to act, and it did not. That it used false or incorrect information to give wealthy communities more money over communities in need, and that it has ignored its mold plan. You've mentioned, Ms. Hajdu, in the press conference that it was the colonialism and racism are a contributing factor. Those 2 words did not appear in either of the Indigenous reports that Karen Hogan released today. Why did you mention them?
Well, I mentioned them because, in fact, it's well documented in multiple reports, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and various different reports. The ongoing systemic oppression of Indigenous people is a well documented phenomenon. I will just say that I would disagree that investments haven't changed. As I said in my opening remarks, that this government has increased investments by 1,100%. But I'm not saying that to boast. What I'm saying is that the gap is so large that even with such a large investment, it still doesn't result in significant change in terms of outcomes, other than to say we are no longer seeing an increased overcrowding growth, but rather we're seeing a stabilization. And that is the foundation that we can now work from. I do think it's important that we call out when systems and structures are discriminatory, because we can't change them if we don't name them. And so that is part of the work that I do as Minister of Indigenous Services, and I think all ministers do in this government.
Okay, I'll follow up. The report said that the Auditor General's office could not find an explanation for why the 2008 mold plan was abandoned. Do you have an explanation?
Well, I think, first of all, it is critical to note that there are a number of houses across the communities that are struggling with all kinds of different repair issues, including mold. It obviously is more intense in First Nations because of the overcrowding, because of the shortage of stock. As owners and administrations of their own stock, it is the responsibility of the First Nations on the reserve to decide how to prioritize those projects, but they are supported. They are supported through CMHC to do that work, and they make those decisions based on their own stock and the needs of their stock. What I can say is we accept the response of the recommendation of the Auditor General that we have to work more diligently together to address preserving stock that's already in existence. I think that is, for me, of paramount importance, that we, and part of that work is the self-determination and how and where to build housing and who should build that housing. Far too often what we've seen in First Nations communities is housing that's predetermined by a very specific plan that maybe doesn't suit the environment that it's plunked into, and First Nations leaders know that they can do a better job when they have more control.
If I could try one over here a little wider, I'm reminded of the book Wab Kinew wrote before he became premier, and we're talking about individual programs here and breakdowns. I mean, I believe one of his arguments would be there's a wider problem here of, a constitution or that sort of disempowers Indigenous people, a government that, in your words, uses maybe a colonial relationship. When we think about Brian Mulroney's legacy today and what he attempted to do with the Constitution, can we even imagine at this point getting into that kind of wholesale reform of just the way Canada was founded as a bargain?
That's a very deep question. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and I'm almost afraid to touch it. But what I can say is there's a lot that we can do without touching the Constitution. And in fact, I would point again to the passing of the UN Declaration Act. There are many ways that we can decolonize from within the Government of Canada to share power and to share resources. The work that Minister Guilbeault is doing and Minister Wilkinson are doing on major capital resource sharing and benefit sharing, that's transformational, and that is reconciliation. Economic reconciliation, I recently held an economic roundtable to talk about the $400 billion infrastructure gap that's estimated and growing in First Nations communities, and that's scoping in things like aging band offices and road infrastructure and all the kinds of infrastructure. we know as a government that we're going to need some help, and we're going to need everybody to be partners. And so the first economic roundtable of its kind was held that brought together big banks. The Bank of Canada was there. The Canada Infrastructure Bank was there. And the partnerships that started to develop at that meeting were just incredible. I noted recently that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is transferring $100 million to the First Nations Bank of Canada so that they have autonomy in how they're going to invest in some of those infrastructure investments. And I'll say in housing, we have, for example, service transfer policy agreements in place with the First Nations Capital and Infrastructure Agency of Saskatchewan and the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. These agencies now have a direct transfer of resources that then they can actually support their member communities to utilize in a way that is self-determined and Indigenous-led. I think that's the path forward. I'll have to leave the Constitution question to the Constitution experts. Thank you.
Anyone else?
For Minister Hajdu, I hear what you're saying about trying to turn this really sort of massive boat around and how that takes time. But the auditor brought up, audit after audit, she's finding the same issues and essentially saying like what we're doing is not working. So I'm wondering, is there anything that can be done in the shorter term to quickly alleviate some of these issues so that you don't have another audit in 5 years that's telling you we still have the same problems?
Well, I think absolutely, and I think to be frank, we are on that path, and so and I think we've spoken about it a number of times. But I think the first piece is the transformation of how we're doing business with First Nations, and increasingly looking for all of those tools of self-determination that allows First Nations to move more quickly in ways that they determine are the right paths for their communities. I have visited many First Nations that have a plethora of different housing solutions. So things from single family units, which by the way was the federal government's favorite way to build housing, built on a colonial vision of what a typical family might look like. That didn't work for many First Nations. And so, for example, in Lennox Island, they have Lennox Island First Nation and Prince Edward Island. They have built housing that supports single individuals, a huge gap in their community. That actually also combines with some basic support for individuals that are having a hard time with some basic functioning, so that those community members can actually stay in community, have a safe place to live, and the community has a plan for how they're going to actually care for members that need that extra support. That flexibility is the way forward. Allowing, I even hate the word allowing, reinstating the tools of self-determination for First Nations to determine what does effective housing look like in their community, what are their needs, and how will they meet those needs. It's truly rewarding when you visit communities that are utilizing that self-determination to meet their own specific needs.
Can I ask you about another financial audit? The Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. I understand there are allegations made against this group, and I'm wondering when you became aware of them, and is this audit sort of normal practice, or is there some evidence of wrongdoing in this case?
I really can't comment on that specific case at this time, as they are undergoing an audit, and that is correct information, but I think we have to let that unfold.
Are you able to say when you became aware?
Just recently, I was informed by the department that the FSIN would be undergoing a forensic audit. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think those are all the questions with that bang.
Ending with a bang.
Miigwech. Have a good day.